The wagon wheel groaned a final weary complaint as it settled into the hardened mud of the yard. From the doorway of the cabin, he watched her descend, a woman made of little more than shadow and bone, clutching a small bundle to her chest as if it were the last warmth left in the world. Gideon Thorne was a man built of timber and stone, a giant whose solitude was so complete the townspeople spoke of him in whispers. A creature of the mountain more than a man, they said. He had paid for a housekeeper, a transaction as cold and practical as trading pelts for flour. He expected calloused hands and a bowed head, someone who would ask no questions and require nothing beyond the shelter he offered. He did not expect the stillness in her eyes. There was an acquired depth there, the kind that came from seeing too much of the world's cruelty and refusing to be broken by it. Her dress hung loose on her thin frame, patched in places where the fabric had given way to time and hardship. Her hair, once perhaps a rich chestnut, was pulled back severely, revealing a face carved lean by hunger and worry. Her name was Ada Brennan, and the bundle was her daughter, Rose. The arrangement was laid bare between them in the frigid air, unspoken but absolute. She would work for shelter. He would provide it. There would be no sentiment, no promises beyond the practical exchange of labor for survival. His home was a shell, a place where grief had long ago scoured away any trace of comfort. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest like a tombstone, gray and weathered, surrounded by nothing but pine and silence. He had no warmth to offer, for his own heart was a frozen, barren thing, a landscape of ice and memory he never allowed anyone to cross. He simply nodded once, a curt, dismissive gesture, and retreated back into the gloom of the cabin, leaving her standing under the vast, indifferent sky. He was offering a roof, not a refuge. The distinction was important to him. He would not pretend this was charity or kindness. It was merely an arrangement, as simple and cold as the mountain air. Ada stood for a moment in the yard, adjusting the weight of her daughter in her arms. The child was perhaps 4 months old, her tiny face barely visible beneath the worn quilt wrapped around her. Ada looked up at the cabin, at the smoke rising thin and reluctant from the chimney, at the closed door that spoke of a man who had withdrawn from the world. She had nowhere else to go. Marcus Brennan, her late husband's brother, had made that clear when he'd found her in the wagon camp outside Redemption. His offer had been wrapped in scripture and duty, but she'd seen the calculation in his eyes. He wanted free labor for his farm and a child to mold in his own harsh image. This mountain cabin, with its silent giant of a man, was her only alternative. She gathered what little she'd brought, a cloth sack containing 2 dresses, a wooden comb, and a small leather-bound Bible her mother had given her, and crossed the threshold into her new life. The first night was a symphony of silence, broken only by the mournful scrape of wind against the log walls and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the infant. Ada moved through the single room with a ghostly quietness, finding a corner for her meager belongings and fashioning a small bed for Rose from a wooden crate and her own shawl. The cabin was immaculately clean but sterile, the air thin and cold with disuse. It was the home of a man who did not live but merely existed. A tin plate and a single cup sat by the cold hearth. A rifle leaned against the wall, its polished wood the only object that seemed to hold any life. The floor had been swept, the few pieces of furniture arranged with precise spacing, as if the room were a carefully maintained museum rather than a home. Gideon sat in a worn chair in the deepest shadows, a looming shape that was more presence than person. He did not speak, did not acknowledge her beyond a glance. He was a sentinel guarding a tomb, and she and her child were unwelcome ghosts. Ada hummed a low, fractured lullaby to her daughter, the sound so fragile it seemed to shatter against the oppressive stillness. The melody was one her own mother had sung, passed down through generations of women who had rocked babies through hard times and uncertainty. For a moment, Gideon's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. A sound like that had not been heard within these walls for years, a lifetime ago. It was an intrusion, a flicker of light in a place he had deliberately kept dark, and he felt a cold, unfamiliar resentment stir within him. He wanted the silence back. It was his penance, his shield against the memories that waited just beyond the edges of his consciousness. But the soft humming continued, a thread of gentle defiance against the crushing weight of his sorrow. And something deep within the frozen chambers of his heart shifted ever so slightly. Like ice beginning its long thaw. Part 2. The quiet reclamation days bled into weeks, each one marked by the quiet, relentless rhythm of Ada's work. She did not speak to him, did not ask for his help or his permission. She simply began to reclaim the cabin from the ghosts that possessed it. She rose before dawn, when the world was still wrapped in darkness, and the only sound was the distant call of an owl hunting in the forest. She would kindle the fire, careful to make no unnecessary noise, and set water to boil for washing. By the time pale light crept through the cabin's single window, she had already begun her day. She scrubbed the soot from the stones at the hearth until they shone, revealing colors Gideon had forgotten existed: amber and gray and rust. She mended the threadbare curtains with neat, invisible stitches, her needle moving with the practiced precision of a woman who had learned to make do with little. She coaxed a stubborn, pale light into the dusty corners by opening the shutters he'd kept closed for so long. The scent of wood, smoke, and old sorrow was slowly replaced by the aroma of baking bread and wild herbs she gathered from the edge of the woods. She had found sage and yarrow growing near the creek, and she hung them in bundles from the rafters to dry. The cabin began to smell of something other than decay and memory. She moved with a silent grace, her hands never idle. She mended a tear in his coat, leaving it folded on his chair without a word. The stitches were small and even stronger than the original seam. She found a cracked ceramic mug pushed to the back of a shelf, and instead of discarding it, she carefully sealed the fracture with pine pitch. Its imperfection, a testament to her belief that nothing was too broken to be made useful again. Each small act was a chipping away at the fortress of his isolation. He watched her from his chair, a silent observer of this quiet transformation. She was methodical in her work, moving from task to task with a determination that spoke of a woman who understood that survival came from steady effort, not grand gestures. He had built these walls to keep the world out, to protect the raw, festering wound of his past. But she was not tearing them down. She was simply planting a garden at their base, tending it with a patience that was more powerful than any siege. He felt the foundations of his grief begin to shift, disturbed by the persistent, growing warmth she brought into his world. Gideon found himself tracking her movements, the small rituals of her day. The way she tested the heat of the stove with a wetted finger before placing the bread inside. The soft frown of concentration on her face as she rocked her child, counting breaths to ensure the baby was breathing steadily. The gentle way she spoke to the herbs she planted in a small box on the windowsill, as if they were living things that deserved kindness. He had forgotten what life looked like. He had forgotten the simple, steady beat of a functioning home. For 3 years, he had existed in a state of suspension, moving through each day without purpose beyond survival. The cabin had been a place to sleep, nothing more. Now there were curtains that moved in the breeze. There was bread cooling on the table. There were the small sounds of domesticity, the creak of the rocking chair, the soft cooing of an infant, the whisper of fabric as Ada worked at her mending. One evening, he returned from checking his traps to find a fire crackling in the hearth, a thick stew bubbling in the pot, and his mended coat hanging by the door. He stopped, framed in the doorway, a behemoth caught off guard by a feeling so alien he could not name it. It felt like coming home, a sensation he had long since buried with his wife and son. The warmth hit him first, then the smell of the stew, rich with wild onions and the rabbit he'd brought back 2 days before. The cabin glowed with firelight, and for a moment, he forgot the present and remembered another time, another home. Another woman who had filled his life with exactly this kind of simple comfort. He looked at Ada, who merely glanced up from her sewing before returning to her work, her expression unreadable. There was no expectation in her gaze, no demand for gratitude or acknowledgement. She offered him this comfort without strings, without the burden of obligation. It was a gift freely given, and it terrified him more than any threat. To accept it would be to admit he was in need, that the stone he had made of his heart was capable of feeling anything at all. To acknowledge this warmth would be to open himself to the possibility of loss again. And he had sworn he would never allow that. He ate the stew in silence, but the warmth of it spread through him, a traitorous heat that had nothing to do with the fire. The ice was not cracking, but it was beginning to sweat, moisture gathering at the edges where cold met something warmer. The thought came from a place deep within him he thought had frozen solid forever. Perhaps survival was not the same as living. Part 3. The breaking point. Breaking point arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a thin, reedy wail that cut through the cabin's heavy silence like a knife through flesh. For hours, the baby Rose had been crying a raw, inconsolable sound of distress that frayed the edges of the day and wore at the nerves like sandpaper on bare skin. Ada walked the floorboards until Gideon thought they might wear through, her own face etched with exhaustion. Dark circles beneath her eyes speaking of too many sleepless nights. Her gentle rocking and soft lullabies failed to soothe the child. She tried nursing, tried changing the infant's wrappings, tried every remedy she knew. Nothing worked. The crying continued, rising and falling but never stopping. A sound that filled every corner of the cabin and left no room for peace. Gideon remained in his corner, a stone statue, the noise grating on him. Digging up memories he fought desperately to keep buried. The sound of a crying child was the sound of his own failure, the echo of a loss so profound it had unmade him. He had held his son Thomas through fever-racked nights, had listened to those same desperate cries grow weaker and weaker until they stopped altogether. He tried to block it out, to retreat further into his cold shell, but the sound was relentless. It burrowed into his ears, his mind, his chest, where his heart, that thing he'd thought long dead, began to hammer with something between panic and rage. Finally, unable to bear Ada's weary desperation any longer, he stood. The movement was sudden, decisive, and it filled the room with his presence. He was a terrifying sight, a man whose sheer size made the cabin feel small, his face a mask of grim resolve. His jaw set like granite. He lumbered toward her, and Ada flinched, instinctively pulling the child closer to her chest. She had seen men like him before, men whose size made them dangerous, whose frustration turned to violence as easily as rain turned to snow. Her eyes went wide, protective, prepared to take whatever blow might come to shield her daughter. He stopped an arm's length away, holding out his hands. They were enormous, calloused, and scarred from years of hard labor and the unforgiving wilderness. His palms were broad enough to span the width of a grown man's chest. They looked as if they could crush granite or snap timber like kindling. Without a word, he waited. His face betrayed nothing, but his hands remained steady, open, patient. Ada hesitated for only a second before her exhaustion won. She was too tired to be cautious, too desperate for relief to refuse help from any quarter. She carefully placed the wailing infant into his massive palms, her own hands shaking slightly as she released her daughter into the care of this mountain of a man. The crying stopped instantly. Rose, her small face streaked with tears, stared up at the giant holding her. Her tiny body, which had been rigid with distress, suddenly relaxed. Her miniature hand uncurled, fingers no thicker than twigs, and wrapped around his thick thumb, And there, against the broad, unmoving chest of the man the world saw as a monster, the baby sighed, a sound of pure contentment, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Gideon stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. The fragile warmth of the child seeped through his shirt, a searing heat against the ice of his heart. She weighed almost nothing, this scrap of humanity, but the weight of holding her was immense. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and strong, against his palm. Could feel the rise and fall of her tiny chest as she breathed in sleep. His own son had fit in his hands like this once. Thomas had curled his fingers around Gideon's thumb in exactly the same way. The memory was so sharp, so vivid, it took his breath away. For 3 years he had run from this feeling, had built walls and distance and silence to protect himself from ever experiencing this vulnerability again. But here it was, thrust upon him by a desperate mother and a crying child, and he found he could not turn away. His eyes burned with something he refused to name. His throat worked, swallowing against emotion he had forbidden himself to feel. Ada watched him, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She saw the transformation in his face, the way the harsh lines softened, the way his eyes, always so distant and cold, suddenly focused with an intensity that spoke of memory and pain and something tender breaking through. "She knows," Ada whispered, her voice hoarse from singing. "She knows you're safe." Gideon said nothing, could not speak even if he'd wanted to. He simply stood there, this giant of a man, cradling an infant with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands so large and rough. And in that moment, the last brick in the wall around his heart crumbled into dust. Part 4. The storm, as if summoned by the shift in the cabin's emotional climate. The world outside decided to turn. The sky darkened to a slate gray, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on the mountain like a wool blanket. A bitter wind began to claw at the cabin, its howl a prelude to the blizzard that would follow. Gideon handed Rose back to Ada with a care that bordered on reverence, then moved to secure the shutters. He worked quickly, efficiently, reading the signs in the air and sky that spoke of danger. The temperature was dropping fast, and the wind carried the sharp, metallic taste of heavy snow. Within hours, the world was erased, buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. The wind shrieked like a living thing, hurling snow against the cabin walls with a force that made the logs groan. Visibility beyond the windows dropped to nothing, just a swirling, white void that made it impossible to tell where earth ended and sky began. The cabin became an island, a tiny bastion against the fury of the storm. Gideon moved through the space with practiced efficiency, checking every seal, every gap where wind might penetrate. He stacked wood by the hearth, enough to last several days if needed. He filled every pot and bucket with snow to melt for water. He was a man preparing for siege. Ada wrapped Rose in every blanket they had, keeping her close to the fire. The baby seemed content, unaware of the violence raging beyond the walls. She cooed and gurgled, her tiny hands reaching for the dancing shadows the firelight cast on the ceiling. It was in this forced intimacy, this white-walled prison, that Rose's fever began. It started subtly a fussiness that was unusual for the normally placid child. Then her skin, once cool and soft as rose petals, began to burn with a dry, unnatural heat. Her cheeks flushed crimson, but the rest of her face was pale as snow. Her breaths came in small, sharp gasps, too quick, too shallow. Ada knew immediately. She had seen fever before, had lost neighbors on the wagon train to the same cruel progression. Her hands began to shake as she unwrapped the baby, feeling the heat radiating from the small body. "She's burning up," Ada whispered, her voice tight with terror. "We need a doctor." There's no reaching town," Gideon said, moving to her side. He looked out the window at the impenetrable wall of white. "Not in this." Storm won't break for days. The storm outside was a physical thing, a force of nature that killed with cold and wind and the sheer weight of snow. But the storm of fear that descended inside the cabin was far more powerful. For Ada, it was the terror of a mother, helpless and alone with a dying child. Her husband had died of cholera on the trail west. She had buried him in shallow prairie soil and continued on because Rose needed her to survive. She had endured judgment and hardship and the constant gnawing fear of starvation. But this watching her daughter struggle to breathe, feeling the fever consume her small body, this was a torture beyond anything she had known. For Gideon, it was a ghost. He had seen this fever before, had watched it with the helpless dread that came from knowing exactly what was happening and being powerless to stop it. He had felt this same cold horror as he watched the life fade from his own son's eyes, had held Thomas's burning body while his wife Anna wept beside him. The past he had so carefully walled off came rushing back with devastating force. The memories were vivid, cruel in their clarity. Thomas's labored breathing, Anna's desperate prayers, the moment when hope gave way to grief, when he understood that no amount of strength or will could change what was coming. And for the first time in years, the stone giant felt the sharp, brutal sting of fear, not for himself, but for the tiny life he had held in his hands only hours before. He and Ada were no longer two separate souls sharing a space. They were two people bound by a single desperate purpose: to keep a fragile flame from being extinguished by the encroaching dark. They worked together through the long, howling night, a silent, frantic pact forged in the flickering firelight. He kept the hearth roaring, venturing into the blinding storm for more wood, his huge frame a bulwark against the wind that threatened to knock lesser men from their feet. The cold bit through his coat, through his skin, but he barely felt it. He filled his arms with wood and fought his way back to the cabin, again and again, ensuring they would not run out of fuel. He melted snow, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt deep inside, filling bowls with cool water for Ada to use. He tore strips from his own shirts to make fresh claws when hers grew too warm from the child's burning skin. Ada never left Rose's side, bathing her forehead with cool claws, whispering reassurances that were as much prayers as promises. She sang every lullaby she knew, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. She tried spoonfuls of water, tried to coax the baby to nurse, tried everything she could think of to bring the fever down. The silence between them was no longer one of distance, but of shared, desperate focus. They moved around each other with an understanding that needed no words. When Ada's hands shook too much to wring out a cloth, Gideon's were there to take it. When he faltered, forgetting what came next in his panic, her calm voice would guide him. The night stretched endlessly, measured only by the baby's labored breaths and the howling of the wind. Part 5. Walls. Crumbling as dawn approached, though no light penetrated the wall of storm, Rose's fever remained unbroken. If anything, it seemed worse. Her small body was limp, her cries reduced to weak mewls that were somehow more terrifying than the earlier wails. Ada sat in the rocking chair, cradling her daughter, rocking with a mechanical rhythm born of exhaustion and desperation. Her lips moved constantly in prayer, words her own mother had taught her, words she hoped might reach beyond the storm to whatever grace might be listening. Gideon knelt by the hearth, adding wood to keep the fire high. His hands were raw from the cold, his face drawn with a weariness that went deeper than physical fatigue. He stared into the flames, and the walls he had maintained between past and present finally crumbled into dust. She spoke first, her voice a raw whisper that barely carried over the wind. His name was Samuel, Ada said, not looking at Gideon, her eyes fixed on Rose's flushed face. My husband. He was a good man, gentle kind. He made me laugh even when we had nothing but hardtack and hope. Her voice broke slightly. He caught cholera 3 weeks into the journey west. Died before we reached Fort Kearny. She paused, her hand trembling as she smoothed Rose's damp hair. The wagon master wanted to leave us behind. Said a woman alone with an infant would slow the train, would be a burden. The other families, they whispered, about what I'd have to do to survive. About what kind of woman travels alone. Her jaw tightened. Marcus found us in Omaha, Samuel's brother. He offered to take us to Oregon, to his farm. But I saw how he looked at Rose, like she was property, like we both were. I knew if I went with him, I'd spend the rest of my life working his land. And Rose would grow up under his hand, learning to fear instead of live. She looked up at Gideon then, her eyes bright with unshed tears. This cabin was supposed to be temporary, just until I could find another way west, another wagon train. But then, she gestured helplessly at the storm outside, at the child in her arms, at the life that had somehow begun to take root in this lonely place. I don't know what this is anymore. The silence that followed was filled only by the wind and the crackle of the fire. Gideon remained still, his massive frame hunched by the hearth, and for a long moment, Ada thought he would not respond. That was his way to observe, to help when needed, but never to share. Never to let anyone close enough to see the man beneath the mountain. Then, in a voice rough from years of disuse, thick with emotion he'd locked away for so long, Gideon spoke. Anna, he said, the name like a prayer, like a confession. Her name was Anna, hair the color of honey, laugh like music. She could make anything grow, had a garden that was the envy of every homestead in the valley. He stared into the fire as if he could see her there in the flames. We had a son, Thomas. He was 3 years old. Bright as summer, curious about everything. Followed me everywhere, asking questions faster than I could answer them. His hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. Fever came through in late winter, swept through the valley like prairie fire, taking the young and the old, sparing no one who wasn't strong enough to fight it. Thomas got sick first. Then Anna, trying to care for him. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I was strong. I survived. They didn't. He finally looked at Ada, and she saw in his eyes a grief so profound it made her own loss seem small by comparison. I buried them on the hillside overlooking the valley, marked their graves with stones I carried up from the creek. Then I came here, to this mountain, because I couldn't bear to be in a place where their ghosts still lived. I thought, he paused, swallowing hard. I thought if I made myself into stone, if I stopped feeling anything at all, the pain would stop. That I could just exist until it was my time to join them. He looked down at his hands, those massive, scarred hands that had built this cabin, that had held a dying child, that now trembled with the weight of memory. I told myself I was better off alone. That letting anyone close was just inviting more pain. But I was wrong. He met Ada's gaze. I wasn't protecting myself. I was just dying slowly, becoming something less than human. In that dark, storm-tossed cabin, their two immense sorrows met not to compound the grief, but to finally share its terrible weight. The silence between them transformed into something different, something that felt like understanding, like the beginning of healing. Ada reached out with one hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Gideon took it. His hand engulfed hers completely, but his grip was gentle, careful. They sat like that through the remainder of the night, connected by shared loss and shared hope, while Rose fought her battle and the storm raged on. Part 6. The breaking of the storm. The blizzard broke on the third day, leaving a world of pristine, blinding white that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sun emerged like a revelation, turning the snow into a field of diamonds that hurt to look at directly. Rose's fever had broken with it. Gideon woke first, still slumped in the chair by the fire where he'd finally dozed off in the hour before dawn. His neck was stiff, his back aching from the awkward position, but those discomforts vanished the moment he looked toward the rocking chair. Ada was asleep, her head tilted back, her face slack with exhaustion. And in her arms, Rose lay peacefully, her small chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of healthy sleep. The flush had faded from her cheeks. Her skin was cool to the touch when Gideon reached out with one tentative finger to check. Relief hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He sat back in his chair, his hands covering his face. And for a moment, just a brief, private moment, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the fear he'd carried through those 3 endless days and nights. His shoulders shook with silent sobs he'd forbidden himself for 3 years. When Ada woke an hour later, she found him by the window, looking out at the transformed world. He'd made coffee, and the smell of it filled the cabin with a warmth that felt like celebration. "She's better," Ada said, more statement than question. She had felt the change in her daughter, the return of health that was unmistakable to a mother's touch. "Yes," Gideon said simply. Then, after a pause, "We need supplies. Flour's almost gone. Medicinal herbs, too. We need to go to town." Ada tensed at the mention of redemption. The town meant Marcus, meant judgment, meant questions she wasn't ready to answer. But Gideon was right. They needed supplies, and the trip couldn't be delayed. The journey was slow, the snow deep enough in places to reach Gideon's knees. He had fashioned a sled from pine boards to carry their goods, and he pulled it behind the horse with Ada riding, Rose bundled warm against her chest. The world was silent except for the crunch of snow under the horse's hooves and the whisper of the sled's runners. When they reached the main street of Redemption, a path carved through high snowdrifts by the collective labor of the townspeople, a hush fell over the few people who were out. They stared first at the hulking figure of Gideon Thorne, the hermit of the mountain, the man who hadn't been seen in town for nearly a year, then at the pale woman walking beside him, the sleeping child bundled in her arms. Whispers started immediately, spreading from door to door like wildfire. The widow Brennan living with the beast of the mountain. What kind of arrangement was that? What impropriety? What scandal? The good people of Redemption had much to discuss. From the door of the mercantile, a man emerged, his face a sneer of smug authority beneath a carefully trimmed beard. It was Marcus Brennan, Ada's late husband's brother, a man who wore his piety like armor and wielded scripture like a weapon. "Ada," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear, pitched for an audience. "The Lord has seen fit to deliver you from the wilderness. Praise be to his mercy." He descended the steps, his boots crunching in the packed snow. "The child and you will come with me. It is your duty as family, as a Christian woman." Samuel would have wanted his daughter raised in a proper home, not in the wilderness with. He let his gaze slide to Gideon with unveiled disgust. With strangers of questionable character. He reached for her arm, his eyes filled with a greedy proprietary light. He saw her not as family but as an asset, a pair of hands to work his farm and a child to be molded in his own harsh image. A woman alone was a resource to be claimed, and he had been patient long enough. The town watched, a silent jury, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They had all heard the whispers about Gideon Thorne, the beast of the mountain, the giant who'd lost his mind to grief and isolation. They expected him to do nothing, or perhaps to react with brutish violence. Either way, they waited for the widow's sad story to take another tragic turn. Gideon did not roar. He did not raise his fists. He simply moved. Part 7. The stand Gideon placed his body between Ada and Marcus with a quiet finality that was more intimidating than any threat. He was no longer the stooped recluse who had haunted the edges of town. He stood to his full, formidable height, well over 6 feet of solid muscle and bone, an immovable object of pure resolve. His shadow engulfed Marcus, plunging him into a sudden chilling darkness despite the bright sun overhead. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the cold. Every person on the street stopped what they were doing, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Marcus looked up into Gideon's face and saw not the vacant eyes of a hermit, but the sharp, clear gaze of a protector. It was a look that spoke of lines drawn and boundaries set, of a man who had found something worth defending and would not be moved. "She is with me," Gideon said. His voice was a low rumble, not of anger, but of absolute certainty, a geological fact, unchangeable as the mountains themselves. The words hung in the frozen air, a declaration that echoed off the silent storefronts and settled into the snow like something solid and permanent. It was a claim, a shield, a promise. Marcus, for all his bluster and scripture quoting, was fundamentally a coward. He saw in Gideon's eyes a conviction he could never match, a depth of purpose that made his own petty authority seem like a child's game. He stammered, his carefully prepared speech dying on his lips. "This is improper," he managed, but the words came out weak, uncertain. "The appearance of sin is your concern, not mine," Gideon finished for him. "Ada and Rose have a home. They don't need another. But the child, Samuel's child, has a mother who loves her. That's what she needs. Not your farm. Not your authority." Gideon's voice never rose, never became heated, but the words carried the weight of stone. "They're under my protection now. That's the end of it." Marcus took a half step back, then another. His face flushed with humiliation and rage, but he could see he had no leverage here. The town was watching, yes, but they were watching him back down from a man he'd called a beast. His authority, his carefully cultivated image of righteous control, was shattering in full view of his neighbors. "This isn't finished," Marcus said, trying to salvage some dignity. "The church will hear of this. Proper people will do nothing," Gideon interrupted quietly. "Because Ada and Rose want to be where they are. That's all that matters." Marcus melted back into the crowd, his authority shattered like ice under a hammer. The townspeople stared, their understanding of the mountain man irrevocably altered. He wasn't the monster they'd imagined, the grief-mad hermit who'd lost his humanity. He was something else entirely, a man who'd found his way back to living, and who would defend that life with every ounce of strength he possessed. Inside the mercantile, Gideon purchased their supplies with quiet efficiency. Flour, salt, sugar, coffee, fabric for new clothes for Rose, who was growing fast, seeds for Ada's garden, because spring would come and she'd want to plant. The merchant, a shrewd man named Henderson, who'd known Gideon before tragedy struck, noted the change in him. "Good to see you among the living again, Thorne," Henderson said as he tallied the purchases. Gideon just nodded. But there was something different in his expression, a softness around the eyes, a sense of presence that had been absent for years. Just before they left, his gaze fell upon a small, simple silver locket behind the glass counter. It was nothing fancy, just a plain oval on a delicate chain, the kind of thing a woman might keep a lock of hair or a small photograph in. He'd seen Anna wear one like it, years ago. "That too," he said. Pointing. Henderson raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he wrapped it carefully in brown paper. As they stepped back into the sunlight, Gideon pressed the package into Ada's hand. He did not need to say what it meant, that she was not a housekeeper or a temporary arrangement, that this was not charity or convenience. In the silent language they now shared, forged through crisis and confession, it was a vow. Ada's fingers closed around the package, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed in the middle of town. She understood. The locket was a promise of permanence, of belonging, of a future they would build together. The journey back to the cabin was made in a new kind of silence. It was not the cold, empty silence of their beginning, nor the tense, desperate silence of the storm. It was a quiet filled with warmth, a shared peace that settled over Retrish Contingent like freshly fallen snow. Soft and clean and full of possibility, Ada held the silver locket in her hand. Its smooth, cool weight, a tangible symbol of the promise he had made. She did not open it, did not look at it directly, but kept it clutched in her palm like a talisman. Rose slept peacefully against her chest, oblivious to the transformation that had occurred, to the battle won without violence, to the family that was forming around her. When they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long golden fingers of light across the valley. The snow caught the light and threw it back in shades of pink and amber, transforming the harsh winter landscape into something almost beautiful. Smoke rose from chimneys in distant homesteads, signs of other lives being lived, other families gathering for the evening meal. The home they entered was no longer his cold refuge or her temporary shelter. It was theirs. The words sat between them, unspoken but understood. As Gideon unloaded the supplies and Ada laid Rose in her crepe bed, now lined with soft fabric he'd purchased without her asking. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Gideon in his chair, Ada with her mending, she finally opened the locket. Inside was space for 2 small photographs or locks of hair. It was empty now, waiting to be filled with memories yet to be made. She looked up at him, and he met her gaze with an expression that was almost shy, uncertain in a way that seemed impossible for a man of his size and strength. "Thank you," she said simply. The words were inadequate for what she felt, but they were all she had. He nodded, then cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, the words coming with effort, "about the spring, about planting. We'll need a bigger garden if—" He paused, then continued, "if this is to be a proper home, for all of us." "I'd like that," Ada said softly. "Rose will need space to play when she's older. A proper yard. I can build a fence," Gideon offered. "Keep the deer out of the garden. And maybe—" He hesitated again, then pushed forward. "Maybe add a room to the cabin, so Rose can have her own space as she grows." They were talking about the future, Ada realized. Not just surviving the winter, not just getting through the next day, but planning for years to come. For a life together. The realization made her chest tight with emotion. She couldn't quite name gratitude mixed with hope. Relief mixed with something tender and new. "I'd like that too," she whispered. The fire crackled. And outside, the stars emerged one by one in the deepening blue of twilight. Inside the cabin, 2 broken people began the slow work of becoming whole. Part 8. The garden at the base of the wall, the seasons turned. A gentle rhythm of planting and harvesting. Of long winter nights by the fire, and bright summer mornings filled with birdsong and the laughter of a growing child. Spring came slowly to the mountain, as it always did. The snow retreated inch by reluctant inch, revealing brown earth that gradually transformed to green. Gideon built the fence he'd promised, strong posts of pine sunk deep into the ground. Rails fitted so precisely no gap existed for deer to slip through. He worked steadily, methodically, and Ada would bring him water and watch as the project took shape. She planted the garden with seeds he'd purchased and others she'd saved from the wild plants around the cabin. Beans and squash, carrots and onions, herbs for cooking and healing. She worked the soil with her hands, and Gideon built her raised beds to make the work easier. To keep the plants safe from late frosts, Rose began to crawl that spring, pulling herself across the cabin floor with determined effort, exploring every corner of her small world. Gideon carved toys for her from scraps of pine, a horse, a bear, a rabbit, each one smooth and perfect, no rough edges to harm small hands. His massive hands, once tools of survival alone, became instruments of joy. The fear in Ada's eyes was replaced by a serene strength. She no longer flinched when Gideon moved suddenly or when his shadow fell across her. She sang while she worked, no longer the fractured, lonely tune of those first nights, but a melody of deep contentment. The cabin filled with the scent of baking bread, of wild roses she'd planted by the door, of the life that bloomed in every corner. The harsh, grieving lines around Gideon's mouth and eyes softened, smoothed away by the sound of a child's laughter. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language of profound devotion. He taught Rose the names of the birds, the jay and the sparrow, the hawk circling overhead. He showed her the secret places in the forest where wild strawberries grew, where a stream ran cold and clear over smooth stones dotted by summer. Rose was walking, her small hand gripping Gideon's finger as she toddled around the yard, pointing at everything with wonder. She called him Gid in her baby voice, unable to manage the full name, and the sound of it made something in his chest ache in the best possible way. One evening in late summer, as the sun painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Gideon found Ada standing in the garden, her hands resting on the fence rail, looking out over the valley. Rose was asleep inside, worn out from a day of play. The air smelled of warm earth and growing things. He came to stand beside her, and they stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the light fade from the sky. "I used to think this mountain was a tomb," Gideon said finally, his voice quiet but clear. "A place to wait for death. But you—" He paused, searching for words. "You made it a home again." Ada turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her face was beautiful, not in the way of youth or perfection, but in the way of someone who had survived and chosen to keep living, to keep loving despite the risk. "We made it a home," she corrected gently. "Together." Gideon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a ring, simple and plain, hammered from silver by his own hands over many evenings in the workshop he'd built behind the cabin. It was crude by a jeweler's standards, but every strike of the hammer had been made with purpose, with intention. "I'm not good with words," he said, his voice rough. "Never have been. But I want you to know, you and Rose, you're my family now. If you'll have me, properly, I mean, not just an arrangement, but—" He held out the ring. "A marriage. A real life together." Ada's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. She held out her hand, and he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, which, of course, it had. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Gideon. We're already a family. This just makes it official." They were married in the cabin by a traveling preacher who came through in early autumn, with only Henderson from the Mercantile and his wife as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, no grand celebration, but it was enough. When Gideon kissed his bride, Rose clapped her small hands and laughed, and the sound filled the cabin with more joy than it had ever known. Winter came again, but this time it held no terror. The cabin was warm, the stores were full, and they faced it together. Gideon taught Rose to recognize animal tracks in the snow. Ada taught her songs and simple stitches on scraps of fabric. They were a family in every sense, not bound by blood, perhaps, but by something stronger, by choice, by commitment, by the daily decision to love and care for one another. One night, as snow fell softly outside and the fire burned low, Gideon sat in his chair with Rose asleep on his chest, her small body rising and falling with his breaths. Ada sat nearby, working on a new dress for their daughter, and she looked up to find him watching her. "What is it?" she asked softly. "I was just thinking," he said, his hand gentle on Rose's back, "about how close I came to missing this, to spending the rest of my life in the dark, alone." He shook his head slowly. "You saved me, Ada. You and Rose. You brought me back to life." "You saved us too," Ada reminded him. "That day in town, and every day since." "We saved each other, Gideon. That's what families do." He nodded, accepting the truth of it. He'd been a man entombed by his past, a mountain who believed his heart was nothing more than cold stone, incapable of warmth or tenderness or love. But a resilient woman and her child had shown him that even the hardest stone could be worn away by the patient, persistent flow of affection and care. They had not torn down his walls. They had simply planted a garden at their base, tending it with patience until the roots grew deep and the walls themselves transformed, becoming not barriers but foundations for something new to grow upon. The greatest strength, he had learned, was found not in a man's size or his ability to endure isolation, but in the gentle weight of a child in his arms and the quiet presence of a woman who had taught him how to live again. In vulnerability, not invincibility. In connection, not solitude. As the fire died to embers and the night deepened around them, Gideon Thorne, husband, father, man, closed his eyes and felt something he had thought lost forever: peace. Not the cold peace of surrender, but the warm peace of belonging, of being home at last. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, but inside the cabin on the mountain, 3 hearts beat in quiet harmony. Proof that even the most broken things could be made whole again through the simple, persistent power of love. The end.